those of you that don't know me, my name is Alisa Guardiola. I am a consultant with LSAT Unplugged. I've been a course member for about 8 months now, and I'm also a TA. And I'm really excited to introduce the University of Maryland. The full name is Francis King Carey School of Law, Dean of Admissions, Jonathan Glick. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your role with University of Maryland Carey School of Law.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Jonathan Glick. I'm the director of admissions. So thanks for having me. I graduated from University of Maryland Carey Law actually back in 2013. Following my graduation, I worked at a law firm in DC for several years before coming back and working in admissions. So it's been beneficial because it's definitely given me the perspective, having been through the process as a law student or applying and then as a law student and then actually practicing as well. So, it's allowed me to wear a bunch of different hats and lend my perspective from a bunch of different viewpoints.
Wow, yeah, I can imagine. And especially, my follow-up question to that was how long you've been in admissions. It sounds like graduating in 2013, you've been in admissions in maybe the last few years.
Yeah.
So is it correct to assume that your time working in admissions has been online, all online thus far?
So I've been in admissions actually for about 4 years now. So I worked in DC at a firm there for about 4 years, and then now have been in admissions for almost 4 years. So it's been a little bit of both, majority in person, and then obviously this last year has definitely shifted things to being a little bit more virtual and online. But our hope is beginning in the fall that things start to get a little bit more back to normal and a lot more in person happens.
Okay, great. I hear you on the virtual. I definitely have a lot of questions concerning virtual, as what you might expect. But before I get ahead of myself, for anyone that's new to University of Maryland Carey School of Law, as far as I'm concerned, you're next to three major courthouses, really large national law firms. You're also close to government offices. So it's my understanding that the typical student that might be applying there might be interested in working on a like national level. It sounds like you yourself worked in DC. Would you say that's the standard student? Is there an ideal type of student that applies to University of Maryland Carey School of Law?
Yeah. So, our location, obviously, we're in downtown Baltimore. So obviously, like you mentioned, it comes with a lot of advantages. You can walk down the street and be within, or, be in three different courthouses: a federal courthouse, immigration courthouse, the Baltimore City Circuit Court. There's big firms, there's government offices. But, one of our big advantages as well is we're about 45 minutes by train to DC. There's actually a train station. It's called the MARC train. There's a train that stops about 3.5, 4 blocks from the law school that goes just between Baltimore and DC. So it's very easy for our students to work in DC. So you're correct. So a lot of our students come to Maryland because they are interested in, working for the federal government. They're interested in working in DC, working for nonprofits, NGOs. The DC Baltimore market is the second largest in the country. So there's certainly a lot of opportunities that come with that, no matter what your area of interest is.
It's interesting that you talk about how large the market is and how many huge sort of opportunities there are surrounding and proximal to your school. But it's also my understanding that your school prides itself on having really small class sizes. So how might that work out? And I imagine it's maybe competitive to get into the school, but maybe also competitive to maybe land some opportunities while in the school. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a couple things. We are a relatively small law school. Our student to faculty ratio is about 6 to 1. So, your big classes, lecture wise, you're looking at, maybe 60 or 70 people. Your smaller classes, you're looking at, 10, 12, 15 people. And so it is a smaller law school. And generally, we do try to keep the incoming class size, a little bit smaller, because we really do emphasize getting to know one another, getting to know faculty, having that kind of community atmosphere, that community feel, and having that supportive environment. And certainly, being at a smaller school, it can encourage that and foster that. Now, obviously, the flip side of that is, yes, it can certainly be competitive to gain admission. But there's, whether it be Maryland or any of the other DC law schools, there's a lot of great law schools, in the area. And, I encourage people to make sure that they're doing research and finding a school that's the right fit for them. Some people really want a small school and they want that small school atmosphere. For other students, it's less relevant. So I think it's important to make sure that students find the right fit for them.
Nice, absolutely. It certainly sounds like it. And I did have a been wondering, and I know it's on a lot of people's minds right now about the sort of response to the COVID pandemic and how schools might be shifting back. And I heard you mention earlier, kind of like a quote unquote like going back to normal. So, in terms of that, and speaking to the COVID pandemic, have you noticed? Maybe I actually was watching an interview with you recently, and you mentioned that this is before the pandemic, you could see up to around roughly a number of like 1,000 applications per cycle. So I was wondering if COVID changed that, and kind of also with that question, uh, I think, now as our country, over the last few years, we've sort of collectively experienced a political like shift, like activity in terms of maybe the collective hive mind, you might say, as a nation, especially with our country and what's been happening. And then I think it's been amplified by the COVID pandemic. So I'm curious, and you said you've been working at admissions for 4 years and your school's proximity to government offices, has that trend as a nation kind of been reflected in the applicants that you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll tackle your first question first. So certainly, I think there's been a rise in applications this year, not only for Maryland, but, everywhere. I think applications nationally are up about 30%. Applicants are up about 20%. And I think part of the surge is certainly due to the pandemic. People have had more time at home. They've had more time to kind of think about, what's next, what's, their career path is, what they want to do. There's been more time to stay at home and study for the LSAT. Maybe it's something where somebody didn't have time with commuting and working and everything. The time to be able to study for the LSAT wasn't there, and now it's been there. So there's definitely been a increase in applications. And I think there were some people who also decided, hey, I didn't want to start law school online. And so there's some people who maybe waited a year to apply in the hopes that everything would be back to being in person. It's hard to predict whether that surge is going to continue. I do think, though, no matter what, and this kind of starts answering the second part of your question, that there's a great opportunity for law students to create change and to make an impact. There's a great opportunity to do that as an attorney. And certainly, I read thousands of applications a year. And certainly I've seen more and more applications from students who are interested in, making a change at the policy level or making a change, at the individual level and litigating. In particular, whether it be immigration or environmental law or health law, there's definitely been an increase in students who want to get into those areas and make a difference.
Which, for anyone listening and hasn't checked out University of Maryland Carey School of Law, it's my understanding you offer clinics in those areas that you just mentioned yourself, which I hope to get to later in the interview. And so the early decision has passed. Today is April, I believe, 14th, and early decision for University of Maryland Carey School of Law is April 1st. But it looks like your website says that you take applications all the way up until August, as long as there's space permitting. That being said, with this sort of up in nationwide that we've seen, maybe because of the pandemic and applications, are you still taking applications until August?
Yeah, so we are still taking applications. I think the important thing to remember, whether it be this year or any other year, is once you start to get past, early to mid-April, you're past a lot of schools' deposit deadlines. And so a lot of times that means those external factors, people accepting spots, people accepting scholarships, those things tend to come into a little bit more play. And so the later that you get when you're applying in a cycle, sometimes, it can make it a little bit more difficult to gain admission. Numbers can become a little bit more important. There's more people fighting for less spots at that point. And so certainly the later that you get in the cycle, it can be more competitive. We are still accepting applications. Generally, I do recommend the earlier you can apply in a cycle, the better. That being said, you should always apply when you feel like you're most prepared and you're going to put your best application in. Applying with an application that you're not proud of and that you don't think is representative of yourself, even if it gets in early, is not necessarily going to be the most helpful.
That's great to hear. It's always good to hear this sort of this reinforcement of, it sounds like what you're saying is take your time and make sure your application is the best representation of you. And quality is a little bit better than maybe just straight up timing on that. So speaking of maybe a holistic view of the application, what would you say University of Maryland's Carey School of Law's attitude generally towards the LSAT score is? How much does the LSAT score weigh in? What about multiple scores? Um, and it kind of a like a side personal question. I've been listening to a lot of interviews lately with admissions officers, and there's tends to be a lot of questions around what part of the application does one read first. I've heard some people say, I look at the resume, I want to know who I'm looking at, and then I read the personal statement. Some people say personal statement first. Do you have an answer to that? And what's the attitude about the LSAT?
Yeah. So for the LSAT, we'll see all of your scores, but generally the highest score is going to be the one that gets the most weight. And, that's going to be the case at the majority of schools that you're looking at. The highest score is the one that's, reported for the ABA reporting purposes. So the highest score is always going to get more weight. Now, that being said, once you start to have, 4 or 5, scores, at that point, if 3 are the same and then 1 is significantly different, sometimes those other scores can start to have a little bit more of an impact because you do start to see that trend a little bit. For the second part of your question, sorry, can you repeat it real quick for me?
Yeah, sure. I did ask kind of two questions in one. The second one was, maybe it's a personal question to you. It's my understanding all admissions officers are different. Do you look
I
at the
remember
LSAT
now.
score first?
Yep.
What's sort of the order that you're looking at an applicant?
Yeah, so generally and again, I think when you mentioned the question earlier, you said it spot on, which is everybody operates differently. And, I think there's a number of people who review applications and are on admissions committees, and everybody may do things a little bit differently. For me, I tend to look at the personal statement first. I practicing, the importance of being able to write it's just huge as an attorney. And so I want to see that somebody can write, but also, I think the personal statement is the most similar to an interview. It's going to give me the best idea as to who somebody is, why they're interested in going to law school, why it's the career path for them. And so I think the personal statement can really give me insight into somebody, and in effect, it kind of can act as an interview. And so I generally tend to gravitate towards the personal statement first.
Nice. It's always nice to hear someone who's just, it sounds like you're generally genuinely interested in who the applicant is and sort of giving them that exactly what I've heard you mention in interviews beforehand, and creating that sort of holistic view and mindset of the applicant. So I have a lot of questions pertaining to personal statements,
Sure.
and some of them are really quite detailed. So I guess I'll start off with this one. And I know that University of Maryland, you asked specifically, there is a bit of a prompt in the personal statement that asks for why University of Maryland. And, just to show that they've genuinely looked into the school and done their research and that they believe it might be a good fit for them. That being said, I've heard before that, the whole maybe cliche of, I've always wanted to be a lawyer. That might not be the best way to approach a personal statement. In terms of why schools, though, something I've been seeing come up frequently is sort of mentioning that one's family lives nearby or they're interested in the surrounding community, and it could be in two different parts. Maybe it's a family members, maybe it's a community. Is that a valid variable in terms of choosing a school? What would you say the strength of that angle is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a valid piece as to why you're interested in a school. I mean, ultimately, a lot of times people choose schools because that's the area that they want to practice. And so a lot of times that can be dictated by family or, some other external factor. And so I think absolutely there's no harm in including something like that in the personal statement. I would recommend adding a sentence or two as to why a particular program interests you. For example, we talked about a little bit earlier, but there's a lot of schools in the DC area. And so, you may want to be in the DC area, and that's great to put that in your essay, but I want to at least have an idea as to, have you given thought about Maryland? Why would Maryland be a fit for you as opposed to some other school, or maybe not necessarily as opposed, but why would Maryland be a fit to you, in this area? And generally, I think most of the why Maryland piece or why any school piece can be accomplished in a couple sentences or a paragraph at most. Remember, at the end of the day, we want to learn about you and why you're interested in law school. And, reading an essay about why Maryland is so great. Um, we're happy to know that you've done the research. We're happy to know that you're interested, but it's not going to tell us that much about you. And that's really what we're looking for.
I think you bring up just such a fantastic point, and in terms of finding that balance of answering the prompt, but also making sure that you're treating it, as far as I'm mentioning, the applicant treating it like an interview where you have this opportunity to speak about oneself. I've had questions before in as a TA in Steve's course regarding how much, if I'm really passionate about this one clinic, and something that we've sort of brainstormed as course members is maybe being really passionate about a clinic is awesome, and it shows that you've definitely done your research. Being passionate about maybe a professor or something of their work, that's all great. We were sort of brainstorming ways of how to make it more personal and how to bring more of oneself into it. We landed on the idea of like perhaps bringing maybe like curiosity into the program, or like bringing up like maybe ideas of ways that you would want to contribute to the program. Do you think that that brings in a little bit too much of like ego of saying I would want to maybe contribute XYZ to this clinic?
No, I don't think so at all. I think, for us, everybody at Maryland who's a full-time student is required to do a clinic. And part of the reason for that is, there's such a need for attorneys and there's such a need for public service. And we want our students not only be involved in the law school community, but to be involved in the broader Baltimore community. And so, we're always looking for students who want to make an impact and who want to make a difference. And so I don't think mentioning where you'd like to be involved is presumptive. I don't think, it's anything like that. I think it's, I think it's great that you've given thought to how you could be involved in the school and how you can make a difference. So I think that's a great way to link it. And ultimately, I think students want to link, the why they want to go to law school piece with the background piece, with the why the school is the right fit. If you can weave those three things in together, generally it's a pretty strong personal statement that flows and kind of has that cohesive theme.
Wow, really powerful. That's something we've all been grappling with, obviously, ourselves, of how to strike that balance. And I actually wish I can have what you just said just on recording and just kind of like play it out loud to myself. So thanks so much for answering that. I have a question here. It looks like it has to do with the LSAT. So does extra time added to the LSAT? I'm assuming there are certain aspects in terms of a test taker that one can ask, and of course they have to fall within a certain realm in order to be granted those times. So would that diminish and I'm seeing already you kind of like setting your head side to side, and it's also my understanding that if LSAT grants something like, for example, like an economical fee waiver or time limits, it's because they've done the research and one is truly deserving of it,
Yep.
and it doesn't in any way, shape, or form diminish. But do you have anything to say about that?
Absolutely, it's not going to, not going to impact the score or the way we view the score. It's not going to diminish anything. Yeah, it's not. There's zero negative impacts, on our end that's going to come from any of that. And
Amazing.
we obviously want students who need accommodations to, request them, to feel comfortable requesting them, and to work with LSAC. And LSAC is, great with working with students and making sure that, the accommodations are provided when they're needed.
I've heard once before that how to know when you're ready for law school is when you can advocate for yourself first and foremost. And I thought that was a great way to put it. And you're nodding your head. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with that.
I mean, I think that's kind of, like we talked about the personal statement, that, it's the personal statement is kind of your interview. It's kind of your opportunity to advocate for yourself, and your whole application you should think of as advocating for yourself as to why, you're the student who should be admitted.
I love that. I love it. Brings up a really great point too, as well as maybe like getting too far out of bounds, out of speaking oneself, whether you're talking about a situation you were in or something like that. When I switch the script and just think, how can I advocate for myself? That really answers a lot of the questions that we've been talking about and brainstorming. So this is already really helpful. Thank you again for your time. I have I have a pretty detailed question in terms of personal statements and in terms of
Sure.
oneself. So I've come across a lot of peers that, for example, say that someone is an immigrant to the United States and English is their third, fourth, fifth language. That being said, if that's addressed on, say, the resume or in the personal statement itself, is admissions or are you looking for perfect grammar in that case? Are you kind of wanting them to pass it along a lot of editing and say, hey, I understand? What's sort of the mindset or lens on that kind of idea?
Yeah. So I think it's always important that somebody's work is their own, right? Whether it be the writing section on the LSAT, whether it be the personal statement, into your exams, into, ultimately the bar exam that you'll take. And, that's part of the benefit of having the LSAT writing sample and it being required is, if there's an LSAT writing sample that reads one way and there's a personal statement that is just completely different, it is something that can catch the eye of admissions committees. So that being said, I don't know every grammatical rule in the world. I don't think most people who are reviewing your applications are going to know every grammatical rule in the world. Being able to have perfect grammar is different than being able to write and being able to write clearly and being able to write concisely. And so I think the ability to write clearly is separate, and that's really the biggest thing we're looking for. And there's a big difference between having a grammatical error and having 4 or 5 typos, right? If you have typos and it's very obvious that you have typos, there's a letter here, there's a letter there that shouldn't be, that's very different than somebody who's making grammatical errors. And for me, somebody who's careless and has a lot of typos, that's going to reflect significantly worse to me. So I think for students who maybe have English as a second language, I don't think having imperfect grammar is something that you really need to worry about. I think, the ability to write concisely and the ability to tell us who you are is really important. And, we do offer an optional diversity statement as well. And, that can be a great place to talk about something that maybe you don't talk about in your personal statement. So maybe, that's somewhere where you talk about, how you've worked and how English was your second language. And now, you feel like you have a strong grasp of it and you're ready to start law school. I think, there's lots of ways to turn something that you might worry about into a positive. And so, I think there's just definitely ways that you can explain something in your application that maybe you're a little bit nervous about.
Wow, this is incredible. These are such golden information. I'm excited for anybody else who gets to hear this recording, especially in terms of just taking something. It sounds like for you and for admissions officers, thoughtfulness, like being clear minded and direct and intentional is one of the most important things that you can bring to an application, and everything else is just an opportunity to maybe just talk about yourself and about who you are. That's kind of what I'm picking up on. I have another language question. I hope you don't mind. Actually, it's so I'm a Hispanic woman, and personally, I was raised with a mindset that in order to look professional, I had to stay strictly in one language. And it's my understanding that a law school application is an opportunity for me to be a little bit more on the polished side. Uh, I've been reading a lot of essays and a lot of writings about how the representation of Congresswoman AOC has sort of been tilting the mindset just a bit. She will be in formal interviews and she sometimes lets a Spanish word slip in order to convey a certain idea that maybe she just can't in English. And I've been seeing actually in some of the course, somebody might use a Spanish word here or there in order to convey an idea. And it might not be in a completely thing, but just one word or two. Is this doable? Do you think that slipping something in like this in order to give more context into one's true background, do you think that it's possible and still look polished?
Absolutely, I think it is. I think ultimately we want to know who you are, and that's that should be kind of the overarching thing that you're thinking about. I know a lot of times people tend to read blogs and Google what's the perfect personal statement and then find a template and think, okay, let me go with this. And that's generally or tell us what they think we want to hear. And that's generally not what we want to see. We want to really get insight into who you are. And so I think absolutely switching languages to convey the importance of something or to really put an emphasis on something. I don't think there's any problem with that whatsoever. The thing that you want to avoid is, you still want it to be an essay, right? So, you want to avoid like writing a poem or, going with really some like abstract form of writing generally, but slipping in, a couple words, whether it be Spanish or any other language. I think there's zero issues with that. And I think it just can give us more insight into you and your personality and what's important to you.
Wow. It's incredible. Yeah, I agree. I think it really could bring in. I know that in the prompts for University of Maryland, it talks about really getting to know the applicant, and so done correctly, it could really showcase who someone is as a person. And it's honestly so amazing to hear from someone that a word here or there doesn't completely dismantle all sense of professionalism. So that's
It's not going to negatively impact whatsoever. I mean, we want students to be descriptive in their writing too, and a lot of times, it is descriptive, right? And it's giving us more insight and more detail in that manner.
wow, incredible. Thank you. I have one last question on personal statement, and I'll see if anyone else has it, and then I promise I'll move on. There's so much more to talk about. In terms of having a JD is valuable, and it can be valuable for a lot of different areas of life. You've touched on that yourself, in terms of the clinics and different kinds of clinics. There's a lot that one person can do in terms of their work when they leave school. Is it a faux pas to write in the personal statement that one might not be intending to be a lawyer whatsoever, but maybe utilize their JD for something that could make it more helpful to have a JD, whatever that may be? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's a faux pas at all. I think because of our proximity to DC, we have plenty of students who come in interested in policy, interested in working in policy or working in politics. We have a specific congressional and legislative externship program. Senator Cardin is a Maryland grad. Representative Swalwell is a Maryland grad. The late Representative Cummings was a Maryland grad. So we have plenty of grads who go into politics and who end up using their law degree in a different manner. I mean, I'm working in higher education now, and if you would have told me that when I was in law school, I don't know that I would have necessarily thought that that was going to be the route that I take. So I don't think it's negative at all.
It's so fantastic to hear that. Thank you so much. It's really a blessing. You should see us sometimes in these rooms, like wondering and figuring out. And I'm sure that we can always reach out to admissions as well. It's something I've heard a lot of people say. Do you prefer a certain way for people to reach out? Is there maybe like a bad way to reach out in terms and a best way to reach out?
I don't think there's, I don't think there's really a bad way. I guess, making a demand like, hi, Jonathan, send me, please call me. I'd like to discuss your application. I think, you want to be friendly and but other than that, I really don't think there's a bad way. I think generally sending an email, introducing yourself, saying that you'd love to, set up a time to talk, or saying that you have a couple questions, and asking the questions over email. I think that's the best way to go about doing it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for answering that. So I'm going to move on to another part of maybe like the application process,
Sure.
which is the interview, which doesn't happen for everyone. It's only for certain candidates. If I become a lawyer, I would be first generation, so I'm completely unfamiliar with what the interview of an application process would be. I know it's not for everyone. Who is a good candidate for an interview? What should one prepare for that, and what should one expect?
Yeah. So I think, in large part, it depends on the school that you're looking at. Some schools have very rigid and strict interview programs. Some schools do group interviews. Some schools do, interviews individually. At Maryland, we can request interviews. We have requested interviews. I know this year, we've interviewed a bunch of students. In order to prepare, I don't think I think the first thing to do is just breathe. I think a lot of times people come into the interviews just terrified. And, I feel pretty confident that if you talked with any students who I interviewed, they would tell you it was, far, far, far from a terrifying experience. Generally, it's just an opportunity to get to know you and to, know a little bit more about why you're interested in school, why you're interested in law school, and really learn about the voice that you'd be bringing to the law school community. I know for me, when I'm interviewing students, that's something that I'm always looking for, is I really want to get an insight into what voice somebody's going to bring to the community, how they're going to, add to the discourse. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but being a relatively small school, we value having a very collegial and cooperative atmosphere, and we value having a classroom where students learn from each other and learn from other students with different perspectives, different viewpoints from different backgrounds. Last year, our incoming class, the age range was 18 to 59. So we had people literally all over the map in terms of experience. And so I think just, coming into it, being confident, um, feeling feeling like you're ready to talk a little bit about the school and ready to talk about yourself is the best thing that you can do to prepare for an interview.
Nice. It sounds like just having a sense of oneself too, and just having that confidence in oneself. It sounds kind of cheesy, but someone once told me that the best cure for nerves is just preparation. Being ready to be talking about the school and talk about yourself. It sounds like it's an easygoing process, and I'm like, what? You're not terrifying to speak to? Who would have thought? Yeah. So that sounds like it was a really great, just clear way to just gain clarity.
And I think,
Maybe.
yeah, and I think too, like, having a story ready, having something that talks that you can say that really is descriptive about yourself. If you have a story ready, that's great. It's fine to write down a couple bullet points and have them up. I will say, just be careful. There are times when I know somebody's written out an entire answer and I can see them staring at a different part of their screen and reading the answer. It's okay to be prepared. I think it's great to be prepared. I think, it's better to have a couple bullet points written out so you're not in a situation where you're reading word for word, because, it can come off as a little bit less organic. So I think, preparing is really, really important, and, preparing the right way is important too.
You bring up a really fantastic. So I assume from for somebody reading off a screen, these interviews you've been doing are virtual,
Mhm.
maybe online and whatnot. Were they virtual before COVID? Will they continue to be virtual? And have there been maybe sort of like mistakes that hasn't happened when something's in person? Like or is there kind of like something that has popped up that's been new that maybe people should be aware of now that we're moving online? So are you planning to stay online and for interviews, and what kind of mistakes have been popping up now that we have been moving online?
So for interviews, there are a significant number that do take place online. We never want somebody to feel like they um, can't interview because they can't, fly to Baltimore and interview, right? So in the past, a lot of interviews have been online. That was certainly the case this year. Um, Schools are going to vary. There are some schools that have in-person interviews and they'll have different representatives in different cities and stuff like that. I think the one big thing that I've noticed sometimes on Zoom with interviews is sometimes people don't turn their cameras on. And I think that, you know, it can negatively reflect on somebody, right? You don't, I know for me at least, the last thing I want to do is just stare at myself talking, for a 20-minute interview. I want to at least see that I'm talking to somebody. So I think, that's something that I've noticed, come prepared, in the sense that you're dressed appropriately and ready to, put yourself on camera and ready for an interview. Is it, the same thing as a job interview where you're going to be sitting in a room with 4 other people? No, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you're ready to go and that, you're able to make eye contact with the person, or eye to screen contact. I don't know what you call it on Zoom, but, that you're able to see the other person and have that, more intimate conversation.
I think you bring up a fantastic point in terms of like maybe something that not all of us have learned in school. I know I was never taught like what is online like appropriate in terms of like camera being on, camera being off. I know that, for example, I might be afraid that a dog would walk in, or like maybe somebody will walk through the frame. But it sounds like just setting aside respect for the time frame, in terms, it could go a long way,
Yeah.
and have a bigger impact is what it sounds like.
And I have a dog. I have a little 10-month-old. I could care less if a dog is walking behind you on the screen. I'll probably ask you the name of the dog and ask you what kind of dog, and I'll go off on the tangent at that point because I love dogs. But so none of that stuff, is really, relevant. in terms of it being negative. I think, just turning the camera on, and not wearing a t-shirt is probably the only step that you really need to take, from
Yeah.
that point of view.
It's really great to hear you say that. It sounds like it's perfectly in line with what you've been saying about University of Maryland Carey School of Law in terms of that personal connection. You have smaller class sizes, you're interested. I mean, everything you've set up into this point is you're genuinely interested in the person and who you're bringing into your program. It's a smaller class size. There are many schools in DC, so you want to know why someone is interested in that one specifically, maybe not just like, hey, I just want to land in DC. Maybe you're looking for someone who's just thoughtful and passionate. So everything you're saying, including turning on the camera, it just kind of is coming back to that sense. Would you say that?
Yeah, I think so. I think we really want to get a sense as to who you are, and I think that's really I know it sounds cheesy, and I know it sounds silly, but it really is the most important thing is just getting that sense as to who you are, and um, why you're interested in being in Maryland. But I think even more than the why Maryland piece, because ultimately, and we know that students know, but part of our job is to tell you why Maryland's a good fit for you, right? So even the why Maryland piece is a little bit less important than the just really telling us who you are, and why law school is the decision for you. A lot of times people go to law school because they want to make change and they want to make an impact, and I think that's fantastic. And I think just being able to expand on that, and let us know why law to make that change, right? Why there's a million things you can do in this world to make change and to really make an impact. And so I think just giving us insight into who you are and what the next steps in your career are, I think is the best thing.
You're touching on something that I actually wanted to ask in terms of you brought it up in terms of the interview, making sure that you have something you could say about yourself, whether it's a story that directly maybe reflects who you are as a person, in terms of the essay, the personal statement, and the application as a whole. Does one have to have something intense happen to them in order for it to be profound enough to want to go to law school?
Absolutely not. I think there's a lot of times there's this misconception, like, I have to have rescued a dog out of a burning building and then be able to write about that. And then, law school's gonna be like, oh my gosh, this person is just amazing. I have to admit them. Now, it's not to say, hey, if you've overcome something, if you've, dealt with something traumatic, that you should ignore that. Cause I think, those types of things do give insight into character and your ability to adapt and handle difficult situations. But I don't think they're necessary, at all. One of my favorite personal statements that I read was somebody who had been working, at a job they weren't passionate about, we'll just call it a 9 to 5 job, basically. And it wasn't something that they, necessarily wanted to do. And, he wrote about sitting on a bench and eating lunch by himself, every day, and just kind of getting lost in his thoughts and thinking about what he wanted to do and what was next. And, it was a really compelling and interesting personal statement. At the end of it, I really got a sense as to who he was and why law school was the right fit. But in the abstract, if I sat down and said, okay, this was an essay about somebody sitting on a bench eating lunch, I mean, that topic does not sound like the most exciting in the world, right? So I think the quality of your writing can be really important. And I think being descriptive in particular in those first couple sentences is really important. Draw the reader in. I always tell people, don't tell me, show me. Be descriptive and in your writing in those first couple sentences that will really make the reader wonder, okay, what's going to happen next? And you can do that, regardless of what the topic is.
I love that point that you're making about being able to be a compelling writer no matter what the topic is, and sort of like overcoming this maybe like misconception that I have to be like a superhero, and then you're gonna love me, and then that's the only way I'm eligible, or any applicant is eligible to be a good candidate for law school. I think what I'm hearing as being a compelling writer, it's my understanding that one is a good thinker, one is thoughtful, and also what I'm picking up on and what you're saying is that as long as the applicant is simply like telling the truth, just being oneself, then it might be absolutely sufficient in order to get to know one person. It doesn't have to be something major, but if it is, that still shows character and can still show someone in a good light as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and compelling writing doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the craziest story in the world for it to be compelling. And so, it kind of circles back to the initial point that I think we talked about with personal statements, which is just the ability to write clearly, the ability to write concisely, and to be persuasive. I think is just really important.
Great, fantastic, thanks. So somehow we keep finding ourselves talking about personal statements, but
Yep.
uh, hopefully people are getting something great out of this, whether they're here now or listening to the recording. I have a few questions from people specifically, and I want to make sure that I get to all of them.
Sure.
I have a question here that pertains to someone who's working actively in the armed forces. So they're in the military. So they have said here for students in the reserves, National Guard, armed forces, who may be wanting to make a switch into careers or getting their JD. Say, for example, they have these mandatory trainings that last throughout the summer that can last for months at a time. If somebody is in the armed forces and they have a training that overlaps with the first 2 weeks of, say, for example, the law school's first fall semester, is that a complete non-negotiable? How would one navigate that? And is admissions the right platform to reach out to about sort of that issue?
So usually what the students want to do is, they'd want to talk to admissions, and admissions may be able to answer. It may also be a question, for student affairs, because, generally in student services, generally once you start, you kind of shift from admissions being your point of contact to student affairs, and student services being the point of contact. That being said, the big requirement for the ABA is that you have to graduate from law school within 7 years. If that means that, you have to take a semester off here or there, or something like that happens, you'd work with with student services, and they'd work on the ability to request leave for a semester or do something like that. Missing the first couple of weeks, we've had students who have missed the first couple of weeks before. It really just kind of depends on the circumstances, and individually, it really does vary. Everybody's situation is a little bit different. So I encourage everybody to just be transparent, have a conversation. What's the worst that's going to happen is they say, this isn't feasible, and that's the ultimate worst thing that can happen. But generally, there is some flexibility a lot of times with schools.
I love the answer that you bring up about creating sort of just like solutions in terms of per semester, and that 7 year window in terms of the ABA requirement. I think that hopefully brings relief to a lot of people, whether they're in the armed forces or if they have another specific situation, which could be just as relevant. I have another few questions here. It seems we have someone asking about how strong the focus on immigration law specifically is at University of Maryland Carey School of Law.
Yeah. So we do have a pretty strong focus in immigration law. We have an immigration clinic, and we actually just received a very significant gift and funding. So we're actually in the next year going to be opening a whole new immigration center as well, and a second appellate immigration clinic. So by the end of next year, we'll have 2 immigration clinics and an immigration center. We're also, I mentioned earlier, we're 3 blocks from an immigration courthouse in Baltimore. I think I want to say there's like 52 in the country. Don't quote me on that. So there's not one in every city, obviously. So there's definitely lots of opportunities. And one of the unique things in our immigration clinic is at Maryland, just generally, there's in the state of Maryland, there's a law that allows students to practice on their professor's license. So in our clinics, you're working on real cases with real clients. You're the one who's responsible for handling everything. And so in our immigration clinic, you'll have real cases, you'll have real clients. Students are the ones in court, they're the ones drafting pleadings, drafting motions, representing clients. And so you have all those opportunities. And generally, in our immigration clinic, students typically handle at least one removal proceeding. So it could be an asylum case, it could be for an individual It could be a custody case, it could be a visa issue. There's a lot of different avenues that um, that students will represent individuals through that clinic. But you'll have your own case, and you'll have your own clients. And I think every semester for the last couple of years, we've had students who have been successful representing people, in removal proceedings. And so I think each of the last few semesters, we've had individuals who have represented clients in asylum cases and been successful there. And one of the unique things as well with our immigration clinic and with our campus is we're on a campus with a bunch of other professional schools for the University of Maryland, one being the School of Social Work. And so a lot of times there's a law and social services program where, once the clinic's done kind of helping on the legal end, there's also the opportunity to help individuals get set up with social services and stuff like that. I really think, there's a whole lot of opportunities in the immigration program. You can always send us an email. You can send me an email. Happy to talk further about immigration or any of our programs.
Incredible. I have to keep my jaw closed because when you mentioned the upcoming news and what's upcoming in terms of immigration and what your school has to offer, it just sounds fantastic and comprehensive in terms of if somebody wants to be involved in immigration law. It sounds like there's a lot going on there. I have a sort of sidebar follow-up question on that, but I do want to make sure that I get to everybody here. So this is a great fun question, shifting gears a little bit, but not so much. After spending time in admissions and after spending time practicing law, what do you wish you had known during your application process to law school?
Yeah, so really good question. I think one of the biggest things, and I know this is something that a lot of students don't necessarily want to hear, but I think it's important to know is, there can be a big difference in 3 or 4 points on an LSAT score, particularly in terms of scholarship purposes. So I think it can be frustrating, but if you take the LSAT and you do okay, but you feel like, on your practice test, you were doing 3 or 4 points better, it can be worth it to just deal with the frustration of having to study for a couple more months and taking it again, because I really do think there can be a big financial difference between, a score that's 3 points higher than another. And generally, I think if you have a score and your second score goes down by, a couple points, that's not going to have, as negative of an impact as, the kind of the reward that can come from a score being a few points greater.
Wow, that offers a lot of perspective. Being in the course for 8 months, I've certainly seen my fair share of people just threatening to throw in the towel. And if anyone's listening to this right now, might I subtly and not so subtly recommend going on the school's website and looking at clinics they offer? Because and University of Maryland Carey School of Law does have a YouTube presence. I was watching it earlier today, and nothing gets me excited about applying for law school and like studying for the LSAT in terms of just looking at what's ahead. So that would be my 2 cents of advice for anyone. Just definitely just start looking at what the opportunities are. You've just mentioned yourself in terms of what could be done in terms of immigration and those asylum cases. That lights me up. So, anybody who's listening in on that, if you're starting to get LSAT fatigue, please go and just read or watch some YouTube videos about what's available to you.
I think that's a fantastic suggestion, just kind of thinking about the end game and why you're studying for the LSAT, why you're taking the prep class, why you're watching webinars and speaking with admissions folks. I think that's a great suggestion because there's a reason that you want to do this. And that law school is the path for you. And just reminding yourself of that every so often is really, really important.
Definitely, definitely, absolutely. And I know that you've mentioned before that your criminal defense clinics, the students also, you didn't mention it in this interview, but for anyone who's listening where immigration maybe it isn't there, like what lights them up, there's a lot more that has to offer. It's my understanding that students partake in misdemeanor cases and handle those cases under professor supervision as well.
Yep, absolutely. So in our criminal defense clinic, Students will represent clients who are charged with misdemeanor crimes in Baltimore. So generally they'll be in the Baltimore City District Court. And so you'll have your own clients and your own cases there, whether it be drafting motions, being in court, speaking with opposing counsel, speaking with a judge, doing all that. But there's also the, advocacy and policy, side of that as well. Students have the opportunity to explore, the consequences of criminal convictions and how they can relate to a loss of housing or employment or financial assistance. Students will do mock exercises and learn how to interview, how to investigate, how to develop theories and so there's kind of the advocacy component as well, and the historical component where you're researching, what's influenced the criminal justice system and working on, criminal justice reform, whether it be in relation to mass incarceration or selective policing or selective prosecution on, communities of low socioeconomic status. So, there's lots of opportunities, policy and advocacy wise as well.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. And I'm sure with the smaller class size, everything that you just mentioned, somebody can get really, really involved in it. I'm sure it can really take someone far in terms of their involvement. I have another question from somebody else in here, and I'm really happy that you're here, and thank you again. So, if someone is trying to start law school in fall 2022, so as we're ending, I have a feeling anyone listening to this right now probably is looking into fall 2022, or maybe they're sliding in to the 21. What would you suggest is the latest? I know that April 1st is the last date formally, but when does scholarship money on average, if somebody is looking for that scholarship money, is looking for that higher LSAT score, is there a sweet spot to get your application in?
Yeah. So we'll take the 2022 example. So let's say you're planning to start law school, not this fall, but next fall, in fall 2022. Generally, I recommend to students, you want to think about taking the LSAT about 12 to 14 months before you plan to start law school. That's going to do a couple things for you. That's going to allow you to get your application in early, but it's also going to allow you to retake the LSAT if you need to and still get the application in early. Most law school applicants and most of our applicants do take the LSAT more than one time, which again, I know is not something that people necessarily want to hear and think about, but most applicants do take the LSAT more than one time. And so if you're taking it a month before or 12 months before, and then you need to take it again, you're still able to get that application in pretty early. Generally, I think if you can aim for getting that application in by New Year's or so, you're in a pretty good time frame. You're in a pretty good spot. Even really, but by February, you're in an okay spot. I think, ideally, in a perfect world, you're getting that application in before the New Year's. I think that's what students should aim for. But the caveat to that is, again, and I think it's the very first thing that we might have started with, is just make sure that you apply when you're ready. Just because I'm telling you it's ideal to submit an application in, by New Year's or so, it doesn't mean on November 30th, you're like, okay, I need to submit this application now, even though, I don't have the LSAT score that I want, or even though, I'm still waiting on a letter of recommendation that I feel like is going to be my strongest one. You want to make sure that the product you're turning in is the product that you're proud of and that you're confident in.
And I just want to bring up to the point that you mentioned earlier in terms of last year's class, you said was 18 to 59, or if I'm getting those numbers right. So anybody that's thinking that they have to rush in terms of age, from the sounds of it, there's a really large age diversity that you also value and definitely consider in terms of bringing in those conversations. One question in terms of timing, and I know it is a delicate balance to figure out application and transitioning to law school, which law school tends to be a full-time job. I know you also offer part-time. One final question in terms of the application is something we didn't get a chance to get to today, is the resume. And say, for example, like COVID-19, it was national and it was pandemic. So gaps, odd jobs, pizza delivery drivers. Does there need to be an explanation for any sort of gap or odd jobs in a resume during pandemic, or is it pretty straightforward? There is a pandemic.
I think it's pretty straightforward. There is a pandemic. Now, maybe if you're applying to law school in 10 years, like maybe it's something that because it's not going to, hopefully, knock on wood, it won't be as fresh on everybody's mind at that point. Maybe it's a little bit different, but generally I think, you don't have to write an addendum or explain that away. I think, in general, just job wise, it's less important what you're doing. It's just important, that you're active and you're doing something. So, we understand the difficulties that the pandemic has caused. And if students struggle to find employment, that's completely understandable. We like to see that students are active in doing something. So whether it be volunteering, whether it be belonging to organizations, whether it be, continuing to just write or read or do things like that, we just want to see that somebody's active. But I don't think that, a student needs to write any addendum explaining anything about COVID at this point.
That's a fantastic to hear, and I just got some messages in the chat that was on people's minds, and they're so grateful for your answering that. I know me myself, I have been a pizza delivery driver, so if anybody is listening to this and is worried about their employment or worried about anything, I'm sitting here and I'm doing this interview and I'm just fine. So I hope that inspires other people. Before we leave for this fantastic evening that I can't say thank you enough for, is there anything that you'd like to mention about University of Maryland, Carey School of Law, or anything you'd like to cover?
So I think first I want to thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm always happy to chat with students. I'll my email I think will be posted on this on the link once it's posted on YouTube. You can find me on our website. You can find my email very easily. I'm always happy to connect with students and chat individually. I think we covered a lot about Maryland. It's a really great place to be. I think I would have a hard time doing my job if I hated my experience when I was at Maryland. I think, you would tell pretty quickly if I was being disingenuous, but I think there's advantages to being in a smaller school, and there's advantages to being in a smaller school in a big market, and being in the DC area. There's just so many opportunities that come with that. And, being in a smaller school, we have a pretty tight, student network. We have a pretty tight alumni network. A lot of the faculty members from when I was in school, and I'm not the best person keeping in touch. That's definitely not, it's something that I work on, but it's not my strongest suit. But I think, a lot of, when I came back, a lot of faculty members, knew who I was, remembered who I was. And so, I think going to a supportive environment is really important. And I think that's something that we really strive to make sure that students feel when they come to Maryland.
That's a fantastic point about making sure that you're going to an environment or what your environment offers in terms of support. I think that coming out of this pandemic, that word almost feels so comforting and so important, especially as a feat as big as law school. So thank you for mentioning that as well. I know I've had a fantastic time, and for anyone tuning in, I hope that you email and reach out to admissions, because I know I've had a really fantastic time speaking with you this evening, and thank you so much. And I hope you're staying safe, and I hope that you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, you too, and thanks again for having me, and thanks Steve, for me as well.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.